Weaving tapestries of code. So the really quick version, in the event that you decide you're done, is this is the intertwining histories of textiles and fiber arts and computing and how we owe the Industrial Revolution and some of our IDE defaults to an 18th century French fashion fad. So we're going to have some fun today. We're going to go through history. So this is my scrapbook. Bear with me. We are going to start in the home of Charles Babbage. How many of you have heard of Charles Babbage? Awesome. So Charles Babbage was a lovely gentleman who really enjoyed throwing parties in the years between like 1815 and 1845, 50, somewhere in there. But these parties were really lavish, but they were different in that they weren't all of high society, they were all of the intellectuals. So you'd see people like the Duke of Wellington, as well as Ada Lovelace, and a lot of the other visionaries that developed the world that we know today. So one day, he was sauntering over to his wall with the Duke of Wellington, who, by the way, if you recognize, is actually like the third in line for the throne of England. And at this point, this Duke of Wellington was seen as someone who was definitely an intellectual. He was very smart. And he kind of points to this picture, and he says, "How was it made?" And the Duke of Wellington looked at this picture, and he got closer. And he's like, that looks, yes, that's a woodcut. It's the best woodcut I've ever seen. And this is a woodcut. And when you look at this image, and you look at the one before it, it does look a lot like a woodcut. But when you get closer, you realize it looks more like your suit jacket than this woodcut. And that's because everything from the background to the image to the words below it are all woven on what is the brand new Jacquard Loom. Now, why, you say, do you care? And the truth is that I have to give you a little bit of a history lesson before you can really dive into this story. So this may be a little bit dry, but I promise it gets better. All right, textiles. When we're looking at like Henry VIII, for instance, the cost of textiles for someone who worked in the castle was about 8 to 10 days worth of earnings for a shirt. Some say that if you were to take that number and you were to calculate it based on how much we make for minimum wage and how long it takes to wash the fleece that you get from the sheep and comb the fleece and spin the fleece and weave it into fabric, sew it together into a shirt, you're looking at about 527 hours. This is between a $3,500 to $5,000 shirt for a peasant. They usually bought about 2 outfits a year. Now, going back to 18th century, a little bit further in the future, this was the fashion in France. Okay, this is not the very simple tunic that you were looking at before. This is intricate. These patterns are woven in silk. The thing with looms at this time is that it took 2 people to run. You had the person that was actually weaving the thread back and forth. Ooh. And you had the person standing on the top, lifting each of the threads, which meant that for a 12-hour day, they were able to weave about 2 inches of French brocade silk. That would take forever. We're talking between 180 and 324 hours just for the weaving alone. That's between 15 and 27 days to make enough fabric, not for her dress, but for his jacket. So the industry was absolutely ripe for revolution. Something as simple as clothing, being able to dress yourself. And fashion was not just important. You know, there were huge, very strict rules all the way down the hierarchy, from the highest of the aristocracy down to the lowest of peasants. You had to have certain bits of attire, or you were seen as, you might as well be naked and imprisoned. So here's the Jacquard Loom. It was patented in December of 1800, which meant we didn't really get it until 1801. And the dates are kind of varying as to when it was officially released. And we all have at least heard of Jacquard, whether it's the Jacquard dies or the Jacquard Loom or, you know, various other reasons. But the thing is, there really isn't anything unique in this. So let's go back to the very beginning of where this started. In 1725, we have Bhushans Loom. Okay, so you see this long paper? That was actually the pattern to program the loom with the pattern that they needed. So if you're looking at this and thinking, you know, that kind of looks like a piano, one of those ones that has the rolling paper, those weren't actually developed until the mid-20th century. So this was actually more of a leftover piece of paper on the floor of his father's shop. His father made essentially organs for clocks. We would call them music boxes. And this piece of paper was where you lined up the pins on the wheel in order to make sure that the music notes came out just right when they were supposed to happen. So Bhushans looks at this and picks up this piece of paper and goes, I have an idea, and puts together this loom. There is a problem, though. This single piece of paper. So if we go back to the image of Jacquard, that took 24,000 cards to develop. And it took about 4,000 cards for the standard brocade. This piece of paper, having that many rows and rows and rows, it was very, very easy to rip. And there was really no way to properly place it so that the cords didn't actually rip right through it when it tried to find a hole or not. It was also very thin because it was left over. 3 years later, his apprentice, Falcone, came out with his loom, where we have the cards. The cards were beautiful in that if one ripped, you just replace one card. It made it easier to swap out bits and pieces. You could even reuse some cards if they happened to match the next pattern that you used. And those patterns would come in and out of fashion very quickly. 3 months, 6 months, it's not really much different than now. So you had to be quick, and you couldn't spend a lot of time. So these cards were more sturdy. They were able to be moved on a more accurate square wheel so that each of those holes on the sides would mount. And you'd have cords that would go down through the holes if there was a hole and pick up threads and lift them up, which is how you got threads down and threads up for the opposite thread to go through to make the pattern. And I'm going to keep hitting this, I'm sorry. So it was about 5 years later where we came up with the flying shuttle. And no, I don't mean this flying shuttle, clearly. I mean this shuttle. But there's a reason I included that slide, and it's because of this. That flying shuttle is being shot across that loom at 60 miles per hour. That allowed weaving to go from as far as your arm could reach across with a bent elbow, hunched over a wheel, you know, this loom, to being able to sit upright and being able to pull to fire that across. So we didn't have 2-foot wide fabric anymore. We had 100-inch fabric. And it was much, much faster. And frankly, you could do it older because you weren't hunched over this machine day in, day out, hour after hour after hour. It revolutionized the industry. It would be another 12 years before the loom was fully automated. They used a water wheel to turn the wheel at the top that had the pattern on it. The problem is, the loom boys that stood at the top, they basically chased him down with a bunch of sticks and threw him in a lake. It didn't catch on very well. They didn't like the fact that their jobs were being taken because they were trying to eat as well. And there was another problem with the actual loom. And it was that that wheel at the top goes all the way back to those music boxes, to those clock organs, which meant that every time you needed to change a pattern, you had to readjust and refit every single fitting in that all over again. It took longer to make one than it took for the fashion to change. The cool thing about Bhushans, though, is that he was the one that created this duck. And the reason why that's important is because it says if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, if it poops like a duck, is based on this duck. This duck would eat, it would move, it would quack, it would poop. Nothing like a defecating duck, right? However, this was also basically the 19th and 18th century definition of a Turing test. This is what they had. If it looks like it, if it acts like it, if it doesn't like it, it's got to be a Turing, it's got to be it, right? So he was a huge developer of autonoma. He created the flute player who played 12 different songs, and the tambourine player who was so lifelike, people thought it was real. Which is why he was commissioned to try to automate basically the weaving industry, and he did it. So why did Jacquard get all the credit? The answer is that he put it all together. He took the system that Bhushans developed for lifting warp threads, and he took Falcone's rectangular cards. He took Kay's flying shuttle. He took Bhushans' top-mounted lever control system that allowed us to switch cards with a foot pedal. And that automated the entire thing. You no longer needed the top boys, but it made the looms much faster. It meant that those top boys could start weaving. There is a problem, though, and we did mention that the loom was developed and released in between 1800 and 1801, but the problem is that we had the French Revolution right before that, and specifically we had the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror, 1/5 of the French population was killed in a 10-month period. All walks of life were in fact targeted, but it was very heavily weighted towards the clergy and the aristocracy. Nobody wanted to wear French silk brocade. Nobody wanted to die. So what happened? What happened to the loom? Spoiler, the looms that we still use today, we still call Jacquard looms because they run on the same principles. But that came a little bit later. What we have today is this gentleman, Richard Roberts, basically the best and first inventor and automator of all time. He invented every single one of these things on this list. And yeah, the electromagnet is on there. But let's look at the 3 highlighted ones for now. We have the self-acting spinning mule. Now at this point, we did in fact have automated spinning machines which made thread. The problem is those machines could only spin 4 threads at a time. His self-acting spinning mule increased it to 80 threads at a time. This took what could have eventually been 400 hours of work and converted it into 9 minutes. All right, Robert's power loom, this is the fully automated, it does not need a weaver loom ever invented. Takes everything that Jacquard did and automates those foot pedals. He also created the punching machine. And this one's for you, Glenn. Without the punching machine, we would not have the bridges that we have today. In fact, the punching machine was created specifically because there was a bridge in Wales that had to be built on a deadline. You don't know what that's like, though. And it was impossible. It was impossible. Because in order to make this bridge stable, they needed to punch holes through steel and hammer in each and every rivet by hand. The punching machine automated that. And why is that cool? Because the same head sitting on top of the Jacquard Loom is what runs this punching machine. The Jacquard Loom evolved into being something much bigger than just a loom. It became a way of automating machines. So when we look at this, we went from 1725 in Bhushans Loom over to his apprentice in 1728. We got the flying shuttle, which, not that flying shuttle, in 1733. And in 1745, we had Falcone Loom. But then we had a really long pause. And then we finished up and very quickly accelerated again. And that pause was caused for multiple reasons. One, because it had already been created once and it was bad. And it took a long enough time for people to put together the pieces. Just because your work is based on other people's work doesn't change the fact that it's amazing. Just because every single one of us in this room is standing on the shoulders of giants doesn't mean your work doesn't matter or isn't important. Every single one of us has something to contribute. So stand on those shoulders and reach higher. Connect a few things together, see how they work, and own it. So back to Charles Babbage. Babbage himself developed a few sketches and a prototype for what essentially was two different machines. Well, three if you count the fact that he improved the first one. So we have the difference engine, and this is all of the piece that he actually was able to build. The analytical engine itself was only ever in drawings, and then the difference engine number 2 was finally built and is currently in a private collection, but for the longest time, in like 2016, 2017, it was in the Computer Museum, the Computer History Museum in San Francisco. So it's 5 tons, and what it does is it computes and tabulates polynomial functions. The first one out to 16 digits. Difference engine number 2 out to 31 digits. And then it would print out a control piece of paper because you could make sure that that's really how you wanted it. You could do those calculations by hand and verify. And then it also created a mold for printing a plate that you could use to print those into books. So that you could do calculation after calculation, page after page, because back in the day they didn't have calculators, they didn't even have the slide rule, and the abacus was not everywhere. So what we had were books of calculations and tabulations, and we would use those books to further science, because it was the resource that we had. So the question for Babbage is if these machines could have been built then. If they had been built then, how much farther in computer technology would we be now? Babbage once gave a lecture at the University of Turin, and this lovely gentleman, Menabrea, took a transcript, and he published it. It was in French. It was in French, and afterwards, he hired Ada Lovelace to convert this transcript into English and publish it. And it is of note that he did eventually become the 7th Prime Minister of Italy. Ada Lovelace. She is a brilliant mathematician. She is the child of Lord Byron, the poet. And as much as that tumultuous relationship resulted in her mother essentially pushing Ada Lovelace down the hard road of logic and science and trying to avoid Lord Byron's fate by allowing her to develop romantic thoughts and poetic natures and inclinations. Ada Lovelace took both. She was very logical, but she had this beautiful poetic way of looking at the world and seeing beyond what was there. So she's translating this transcript with the help of Charles Babbage. And she does, in fact, calculate using, punch cards and whatnot she did calculate an algorithm, the very first algorithm. And she made sure that it was something that could run on the analytical engine if it were ever built. And that's why she's the first computer programmer. The book that she published, her notes were longer than the transcript. So again, Ada Lovelace's work was based on a machine by Charles Babbage. It used a mathematical equation that had been discovered hundreds of years earlier. And she was hired to do this by another gentleman who had actually written the transcript. And she worked with the originators to come up with this translation and notes and this program. So why did she get the credit? And it's because she looked beyond, and she realized that it wasn't just calculations this machine could do. It could run the world. So then we skip a few years, and we have Herman Hollerith. And Herman Hollerith's doctoral thesis was an electric tabulating system using punch cards to keep track of information. And what essentially that meant was that you had like two electrical plates, and they would touch, and wherever the electricity currents were coming through and touching the other side, it would be recorded, which meant that if there's a hole in the paper of the punch card, you got a recording, and if there's not, you don't. Pretty simple, but revolutionary. So the first census, a year later, used punch cards to record. And then you had this business that he developed straight out of his thesis. Ended up combining with 3 other companies to become a 5th company called Computing Tabulating Recording Company in 1911. 13 years later, that company was renamed to IBM. And 4 years later, they created what you see at the top of the screen here, which is a rectangular hole punch system, which allowed for 80 characters wide and 24 characters tall. And if you don't know, all of our ADEs still are defaulting to 80 characters wide. Many CLIs for systems, hardware systems, are still 80 characters wide and 24 pixels tall. So that was much faster. I mean, it was 1800 to 1924. There weren't as many gaps. It was a lot more stable growth. But what's interesting about this is the fact that we went from the Jacquard Loom, which used punch cards, to Charles Babbage, who based his analytical engine on running with punch cards, and Ada Lovelace, who took those punch cards and wrote the first systems, the first programs, algorithms, who then handed those punch cards on, and those punch cards became how we recorded information using electrical circuits and electrical signals. So we're going to change gears. Because at this point, we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into World War I, World War II. And I love this quote. It's so mysterious and so it just makes me smile. During wartime, where there were knitters, there were often spies, pairs of eyes watching between the click of 2 needles. And the question there is, how much did we code into our knitting? The very first reference to cryptography and knitting was Charles Dickens in A Tale of Two Cities. Madame Defarge was a ruthless, bloodthirsty woman who would sit in revolutionary meetings while they argued the fates of the aristocracy and knitted their names into her projects. More specifically, those that she wanted to die. Don't mess with knitters. When doing research for this, I was looking for stories, trying to find examples of when knitting was actually used as part of the cryptography work that we've all seen, right? And I discovered that Belgium created some really incredible knitters. So get this one woman, she took her knitting and she jumped out of an airplane and landed in Germany and biked across, being helpful while just knitting away and getting information from German soldiers and immediately passing that back to the Allies. This other woman would sit at her window and look at the train station, and she'd knit and rock and tap her feet, while her children below were converting that Morse code into messages, all while a German sergeant was living in their house. There's another woman who also had a window over a train station, and based on her rate of knitting and the fact that she would purl when there was a supply train and yarn over when there was a personnel train, they could figure out when those trains showed up and what their schedule was. In fact, it got to the point where in World War II, the British Office of Censorship prevented knitting patterns from being published. For the most part, it was abroad, but oftentimes it was also there, just in the off chance that someone had somehow encoded a message. So let's look at these. These are mine. So I knitted a sweater, and I do this a lot, clearly. So I knitted a sweater that converted a message to binary to knitting stitches. Each letter is 8 characters wide, and in between each character is a space, a yarn over, allowing me to put these messages of React Rally 2017 and JSConf 2017 into my sweater. And those were the first 2 conferences that ever accepted me to speak. You know, and it goes beyond cryptography into mathematics. This woman, Diana Tiama, was learning hyperbolic geometry in the 70s. And her teacher would say, okay, so you know that in like the normal math that we know, the normal geometry, these 2 top lines are parallel. They're never going to cross. But in hyperbolic geometry, all 3 of these intersecting lines are parallel with the line below it. And she looked at that and went, what? How is it even possible? And they're like, you're just going to have to imagine it. And she's like, fine, pass or fail, got past the class, and went, thank goodness I'll never have to deal with hyperbolic geometry again. Until 20 years later when she found herself teaching hyperbolic geometry. And she was not thrilled. But the more that she dug into this, the more that she realized that the math for hyperbolic geometry was a crochet pattern. And based on the unique structures that crochet gives us, she was able to replicate a hyperbolic plane in crochet. And for the very first time in the 90s, we were actually able to see it. And the reason this is important is because it's not just things like coral that apply with hyperbolic geometry, it's things like the shape of our universe. First time. Not only that, but she was also the first mathematician to publish in a major journal a crochet pattern. And they fought her tooth and nail. Mathematicians do mathematics. They don't do crocheting. Crochet is something women do when they have nothing else to do. Which is why a few years later, that same journal published the Lorenz Manifold, also crocheted. Because again, the ability to see thermal convection, the rising and cooling of hot air in the atmosphere, was captured for just a moment or forever in this crochet piece. They could see it, they could interact with it. And it's due to the unique properties of crocheting. And I would be remiss as a knitter if I didn't mention the Mobius strip, which most women wear all fall long. And you can make it out of paper, but it's just not as warm. But the Klein bottle we've developed and used and made out of glass, but it's not quite the same. You can't just touch one side and spin it and realize that you can touch every surface without lifting your finger, both inside and out. And the Klein bottle is a three-dimensional version of a Mobius strip. Knitters make hats, but we can interact with those hats and we can pull them out and turn them around and flip them inside and see it and feel it and experience it. And that's the thing with knitting and crocheting and all of the fiber arts, from embroidery to cross stitch, is the fact that we can see it and we can feel it. There was a fad that I love where people would go through and every day they would knit a color based on the temperature of that day. This, however, is a little bit different. It doesn't take one day for a year. It takes today for the last 100 years. Just let that sink in for a second. So there are, in fact, 366 scarves showing the temperature on one day for 100 years, and they all look like this. And then there's this lovely person who actually knit their son's sleep pattern into a blanket. The first year sleep pattern, watching them go from erratic as a newborn all the way to very structured by the time they were a year old. And then there's the woman who knit on the train, and every time she got stuck in a delay, she knitted a different color. And that sold really well. She's making another one. And these data visualizations have the impact to touch you. You can wear them. You can see them, you can hold them, you can use them. But the fact that you can actually physically, tactily interact with them changes it from a chart that no one cares about, or maybe you care about, but to something that you hold, to something that becomes real. And then those same tactile senses can then control our technology. We have at this point taken IoT to the place where you can use sensor motion to control your phone from your jacket cuff. You can make pianos that you just roll up and shove in your bag. Our clothing becomes the technology. In fact, there's a project called Google Jacquard that has paired with Levi to make that jacket. You can buy it. So moving beyond that, I want to pose a question. Is knitting programming? Who says yes? You're cheating. Who says no? Who wants to see the next slide? All right. Well, I'm not going to give you the answer yet. So, this is knitting. There's 3 things that you need to keep track of in knitting, okay? You have a knit stitch and a purl stitch and a yarn over stitch, except really you have a knit stitch and the back of a knit stitch and a yarn over. But this lends very beautifully to that binary that I showed you before. But when you're looking at a knitting pattern, this is what it is. How many of you can read this? I see like 6 hands, and I'm so happy. All right, but when you really look at this, we have a few things we need to keep track of, right? There's like, okay, multiples of 8 plus 1. That's relatively easy to figure out, but what if you want 18 stitches worth, or 18 inches worth? What if you want 30 inches worth? And you have these asterisks that are everywhere, and you have these parentheses and these random to last 6 stitches things. So there's a lot of things you're trying to keep track of in this. So I converted it over to a program, and you can see it on GitHub. And it took about 250 lines to do what this does. All right, so let's walk through this a little bit, okay? So for each row, you are going to work the pre-loop stitches, or the pre-repeats, right? So in this case, it's a knit 2, and the asterisks are what wrap a loop. So then we're going to do the loop stitches, which in this one is purl 1, knit 3. And we're going to do that over and over and over again until we have 3 stitches left. And last I checked, that was a do while. Do this while you have more than 3 stitches on the needle. And then you do your post loop stitches. That's it. But in that, we've learned how to write a function for each, through each row, do something if it's the first one, make our repeats, loop through those, and if it's not the first one and you've got nothing at the end, maybe it's an else, do the last set of stitches. They've actually used knitting in third world countries that have less access to computers as a programming simulator in the same way that you would give a pilot a flight simulator to teach them the basics of programming until they can get a hold of a computer. Because it teaches you the same thought models. When you're writing a pattern, reading a pattern, you're dealing with do-whiles, if-elses, for-eaches. The things that maybe when you were starting, I certainly did, wondered why would I ever use a do-while? To do this. Is it a Turing-complete programming language? I don't know. But I can tell you that this made my learning how to program ridiculously easy, because as soon as I started seeing how those programs were functioning, I'm like, oh yeah, I've done this before. This is easy. It trains your brain to think that way. So I'm going to share a very, very long quote, and I am going to read it because I think it's special. And that's why no one recognized that when I was conjugating French irregular verbs, I was actually practicing my pattern recognition skills. And when I was excited about knitting, I was actually following a sequence of symbolic commands that included loops inside of them. And that Bernard Russell's lifelong quest to find an exact language between English and mathematics found its home inside of a computer. I was a programmer, but no one knew it. And with this, I want to say that computers are magical. Technology is beautiful. There's logic, and there's beauty, and there's math, and there's music. But sometimes you have to step away from the computer to find that inspiration. Maybe it's in your dad's leftover piece of paper that he threw on the ground after trying to develop a wheel for a music box that makes the next revolution happen. Maybe it's reading a mathematical equation and realizing it's a pattern and creating the first ability to interact with a hyperbolic plane. And maybe it's learning a new language that teaches you the ability to recognize the patterns behind syntax. So when you're looking for that next technology, remember that every single technology that we have out there, whether it be React, whether it be Angular, whether it be Vue, every single one of them is bringing something to the table, and we are all learning from each of them. All of them have a place, and the competition is fun. So maybe step out of your wheelhouse for a minute and see what's out there and then bring it back? What will you create? My name is Jen Luker. I am a senior front-end engineer at Gremlin, and you can absolutely talk to me on Twitter. It is the best ways to get a hold of me. I'm at Knit Code Monkey, and if you would like more information, I have a lot to share. Thank you.